Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a prequel of a previous lesson from Luke's 8th chapter. In the lesson we did before this, we covered verses 26 through 40. We're going to try and make it all the way through the 25, and there are 5 main themes of this passage we intend to cover. The first of which is the females in Yahshua's ministry orbit, the second of which is the parable of the soil, and we'll explain why we feel this is a more appropriate designation of the parable than is customarily assigned to it, the seed, when we get to it. The parable of the lamp, he redefines the family, and then they cross the Galilee, him and the 12, the disciples, where they encounter a demon-possessed man, which forms the substance of the lesson I already covered. But what comes in the lesson, the verse before this, is an anonymous female sinner who embraces him at a Pharisee named Simon's house, and he explains a parable of forgiveness. So that establishes the momentum and the continuum of the females in his ministry. And you cannot find a single place in the New Testament where Yahshua had an enemy that was female. He was a friend, uplifter, elevator, and equalizer of women all the way. So the first verse of the 8th chapter says, "And it came to be afterward that he went through every city and village, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of Elohim. And the 12 were with him." So the time reference is afterward. We don't have an exact chronological designation between the events in the preceding chapter, but what he's doing here is he's retouring the countryside of Galilee. We witness him in the previous chapters more in the synagogues in Capernaum. Here he's off to the country, and he eventually speaks in parables because the religious establishment was trying to trap him. They were already set to kill him, and they were stalking him and following him, waiting for him to say some doubtful utterance of reproach, according to which they could indict him according to Roman law or their own law. But he was determined to not be trapped. He had a cognizant sense of his time all throughout his ministry. His time was the time of the cross, and his death is arguably more useful to us. But we're of course grateful that he was alive, and we believe his life was essential for our own eternal life. And he's doing the same thing. He's preaching the good news. The kingdom is the topic of his preaching, the kingdom of Elohim. And the 12, those are the disciples, the intimate companions, even Judas were there with him. "And certain women who were healed of wicked spirits and sicknesses, Miriam called from Magdala, out of whom came 7 demons." So Mary of Magdala is more familiarly known as the first witness of the resurrection, but before she was given this privilege, she was in fact a demon-possessed woman, 7 demons. So imagine 7 demons attacking one person at the same time. And whenever we read the word 7, there's a few others, 4, 3, and 12. In the Bible, it is numerologically significant. So 7 indicates is the number of divinity, completeness, and fullness. So we gather that she was fully demon-possessed. She had a team of 7 bothering her and harassing her and reduce. What demon possession does is reduces those it afflicts to states of insanity and loss of self-control. They lose their sanity and self-control. But 7 is also the number of divinity. So the redemptive reach, there is no chasm in Satan's territory where his redemptive reach cannot spread. So this one-time woman who could be demon-possessed by 7 demons could live to be the first witness, as well as the most treasured female servant. He does establish her work as more worthy than her sister Martha's in the 10th chapter of his female disciples. And Johanna, the wife of Cusas, manager of Herod, and Susanna, and many others who provided him for their resources. So we don't read of these 2 particular women anywhere else in the New Testament, but this first one is connected. She was the wife of the steward of Herod in charge of his financial resources. So they donated monetarily to the mission and the ministry. And this other woman, Susa, must have contributed that way, Susanna. "And when a large crowd had gathered, and those who were coming by to him from every day, he spoke by a parable." Now, a parable, first off, is a means of relating a new truth in a familiar setting or scenario. a relatable hypothetical through which didactic truth, didactic is by definition intended to impart or instruct a moral lesson, in illuminating insights through familiar yet relatable scenes with spiritually significant truths unraveled, and some of them require explanation. This is one of the ones that is otherwise undiscernible without the Savior's own explanation. And this is one of the three ones that repeat throughout the Synoptic Gospel. And we earlier mentioned we feel that it's often referred to as the parable of the seed, which is likened to the word of Elohim, but we feel it's more appropriate the parable of the soil, because as we read that the soil is analogous to the human hearts. There are different stages of receptivity to the saving message, and only of the four hypothetical given, only one is fruitful and abundant in producing its intended effect. A sower went out to sow his seed, and as he sowed, some indeed fell by the wayside, and it was trodden down, and the birds of the heavens devoured it. So this is physically relatable imagery, but he's leading up to something spiritually significant. This is leading up and culminating into a spiritually significant truth through the story. So parables are ways and means of illustrating truth in a more lifelike manner than is possible or available by abstract doctrine or anything else or general principle. This really gives life to the truth itself by putting it in everyday scenes. And others fell on rock where it had grown up and withered because it had no moisture. And others fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up, and with it choked it. And others fell on the good soil and grew up and yielded a crop 100-fold. Having said this to them, he cried, "He who has an ear to hear, let him hear." So we read of three types of seed and three types of soil, and three, they are analogous to evangelical outburst or a success, evangelical fruitfulness. So the gospel, not everyone who hears it is going to be embracing of it. Some will reject it for the variety of reasons. So maybe 1 out of every 4 person, this ought not be interpreted as mathematically exact, just because there is something numerologically significant that we otherwise read. But it does describe, as we will read, the soils are analogous to the one that was good yielded crop, and it did its intended function, which is to disciples are made to make more of the same. They are not additions, but best thought of as multiplications. Our goal is to multiply, not increase disciples, and the way we do that is to make disciples who make disciples. And he says for the first of 7 times, in the passage from now to the 18th verse, he references the importance of hearing, and hearing in this sense is more than physically absorbing. It is intellectually understanding and spiritually absorbing and digesting and consuming what he has to say. And his disciples were asking him, saying, "What does this parable mean?" So now he's in the company of his disciples. There's no mention of the crowd that was with them earlier, and to him is revealed the parable. The crowds must have walked away perplexed and bewildered, but the disciples genuinely want to know, and because they have that intimate access and availability, they are privileged to ask what is otherwise a mystery to everyone else who heard it. And he said, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of Elohim, but to the rest in parables, that seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not understand." So he's telling them of their privileged position. They will be given insight and illumination and understanding as to what these parable means, whereas they remain undecipherable to those without spiritual intuition or without spiritual resources. He is the supreme resource in their midst, and he's the one who's going to tell him the truth. But he establishes the dichotomy between those them and them. So the crowd, the masses, the world, whatever, he quotes a passage from Isaiah, so they see, but they don't really see. So there's they can see with their eyes, they can hear the message and not understand it. So seeing is, there's physical sight, but there's also the eyes of faith, 2 Corinthians 5:7, through which we digest, observe, and interpret accurately spiritual truths. And this is the parable. The seed is the word of Yahweh. So that is the seed, that is the word of Yahweh. This is implicitly alluded to, although I wanted to save my commentary and analysis based on his explanation of his interpretation. So I didn't say as much before, but the seed in all these cases, in all four cases, is likened to the word of Yahweh, which must be spread and planted and harvested and cultivated in order to be fruitful. And those by the wayside are the ones who hear. Then the devil comes up and takes away the word from their hearts, lest having believed they should be saved. So the first set of the crops, they are the ones who fell by the wayside, trodden down, and eaten by the birds of the heaven, and they are likened analogously to those who, upon hearing the word, immediately counter Satan and surrender without resistance. So when you become born again, or when you hear the gospel, expect Satan and his minions to attack you, and if not Satan himself, that's not a normative experience, but his demons will try to cast a spell of confusion among you that and he wants you to surrender without resistance. So if you are still struggling, you should thank, if you're struggling to accept this faith, that means you have a mustard seed of faith from which theoretically unlimited growth potential can come. And those on the rocks are those who, when they hear, receive the word with joy, and these having no root, who believe for a while, and in time of trial fall away. So this is what we refer to as the fair weather faith disciple variety. It's easy to praise Elohim or God when things are going well, but the real test, the sun, is analogous to trials and persecution. So many of us in America were willing to live for the faith, but how many of us are willing to die for the faith? So the persecution separates the wheat from the chaff, the inauthentic from the disciples meriting of salvation. But, as soon as persecution comes, that immediately weathers the authentic disciples, those who belong to them, the goats from the sheep, the wheat from the chaff, et al., etc., whatever analogy we want to use to the unbelieving and lost and the believing and saved. And those on the rock are and that which fell among thorns are those who, when they have heard, go out and are choked with worries and riches and pleasures of life, and bring no fruit to perfection. So in our spiritual warfare, we have three enemies: the world, the flesh, and the devil. And we witness two of them here. The first fold, they are encountered almost immediately upon hearing, and they surrender without struggle to Satan. They let him get in their head, influence them that this is not for them, this is not for us, this is silly, this is confusing, I don't need this, I'm going to go keep on living the way I'm living. And the other is the world, which offers us no shortage of distractions and can compromise our full attention, which by right ought to be given to the word and the principles contained therein. So the worries, riches, pleasures of life, that just means that's the flesh. So all three enemies are once again encountered. The three enemies of our warfare: the world, the flesh, and the devil. And the way I like to break it down is the latter of which is commonly manipulating the second of which to conform to the first of which. So the world caters to the flesh and the desires and designs and appetites of Satan, they cannot bring fruit when they're in the world. When you're in the world but not of the world, that's when you can bring fruit into the world. But so the seed is divine. And one of the things I should communicate, maybe perhaps sooner than this, is that the ministry of conversion is not our own. It belongs solely to the Spirit. Our job is to spread the message that saves, but we cannot take credit for the conversion or the salvation. That is wholly a divine work from start to finish, but through our words, divinity may manifest in the hearts and minds and ears of others. And that on the good soil are those who, having the word with a noble and good heart, retain it and bear fruit with endurance. So this is in contradistinction to the fair weather disciples who did not endure. They gave it up as soon as the persecution, the sun in the original metaphor is analogous to persecution. They stick with it, they endure it, they're willing to live for it, they're willing to suffer for it, they're willing to die for it. And that is the only fruitful soil of those who, as it's from a noble and good heart. So the soil of the seed is analogous to the human heart, which is the receptor of the message, and that's why we feel it's appropriate to refer this to the parable of the seed, not the soil, because what's really significant is not obviously more significant than our own human hearts is Yahweh's word, but what's most significant for us is our state of receptivity to the good news, the saving message, and our willingness to spread it at all hazard and all cost and all pain and all promise of persecution. That is what makes a disciple, that makes a disciple, that makes a disciple. So evangelical fruitfulness, we have to condition and cultivate the soil of our heart to be continually reminded and fulfilled by this. We have to read this book every day. That's one of the things I can't imagine anyone who calls themselves a Christian yet doesn't read this book every day. Next parable is the one of the lamp, which is a physical instrument of light. I'll say a few things in advance of commenting on it. We as Christians are to function as light vessels and sea lights in a dark and fallen and perverse generation, and what he has to say about the lamp will influence my interpretation. And no one, having lit a lamp, covers it with a vessel or puts it under a bed, but he puts it on a lampstand so that those coming in sees the light. So a light that is hidden is effectively rendered obsolete and useless by its concealing. Light cannot spread its luminosity unless it is exposed, and purposely so. So we are not to hide our faith. We are not to keep it secret or suppress it. We are to share it with others in the interest of spreading and advancing the kingdom and making disciples who can make disciples. So the purpose and a function of a light is to be placed, in order for its function to be fulfilled, is to be placed in a place that is conducive to its light to spread. Otherwise, it's going to be useless if it's concealed. For whatever is hidden shall be revealed, and whatever is secret shall be known and come to light. He also mentions much the same thing, albeit in a different context, in the 12th chapter, in the 2nd verse of Luke's gospel. But the principle communicated through the passage is that not everything that we have to live with a mystery, much mystery, and that's part of what it means to be living by faith. But if we endure to the end with our faith intact, we will reach heaven, where everything will be made known to us, and everything that is secret shall be known and come to light. So by the negative principle, when we arrive at the judgment, every sin we've swept under the rug, every sin we've told ourselves just to forget about, everything we've kept secret from the world and even ourselves will be brought to light by the one who judges us perfectly. He has subterranean insight into our heart, and he has omniscience, so there's no sin that he cannot remember. Therefore, take heed how you hear. For whosoever possess, to him shall be given, and whoever does not possess, even that which he thinks he possesses, shall be taken away from him. So we've heard the word hear quite a lot, but what's most significant here is how you hear. So that we hear is not enough, it's how we hear, and this brings us back to the passage of the parable of the soil. So how we hear is how we condition our heart, which is the ultimate receptor of the message that's saved. And the principle is that he who has wealth, spiritual treasure and wealth, shall be made spiritually wealthier on top of what they have. So revelation is a structure we cannot build without the foundations and the building blocks, the basic principles, and to whom is given little shall be added more and more and more. Whereas those who think they know, but neglect to continually cultivate the soil of their own heart shall lose what they once thought they knew. So knowledge is not permanent apart from him. It is possible to come to a converting faith and lose one's salvation. This much is made plain in passages such as Hebrews 10:26, 27, and 2 Peter 2:20, 21. And his mother and brothers came to him, and they were unable to get to him because of the crowd. So the crowd has sort of crept in and come back, and his mother and his brother, his mother was named Mary. We read of this as in Luke's 1st chapter. She was a virgin birth, and after she gave birth to the seed that the Ruach Kadesh implanted in her belly, chapter 1, verse 35, we read that the Trinity was involved in the whole process through and through, if we read that verse beginning to end. But his mother was named Mary, and she was the husband of Joseph, through whom she conceived brothers and sisters. These brothers are named in Mark 6:3, and the sisters are also referenced, but here it's just brothers. And they have difficulty getting to him because of the crowd. So what happens is that an intermediary steps in and tells them they're here. And it was reported to him, saying, "Your mother and your brother are standing outside, wanting to see you." So he's relaying this information that his mother and his brothers are standing outside, and the evidence indicates in Mark 6 chapter and also John 7:5 that these brothers struggled to believe in his messianic and divine origins during his own lifetime. They would have had access to his mother. They would have been stepbrothers first off, because Joseph was his stepfather. These would have been sons of Joseph, who we can accurately imagine was dead at this time, else he would be there with them. So there's no mention of Joseph or the father. Mary lived to bury her son, and she's with the disciples, the apostles, as they would soon be known, in the first chapter of Acts. So she outlived her son, but the father did not. And the brothers who became witnesses, personal witnesses to the resurrection, became fully convinced that he was who he claimed he was. So there was a source of division and confusion even in his own household, and he expects us to expect much the same thing in ours. So, but they became stalwart defenders and avatars of the faith after beholding the resurrection. James and Jude are two authors, two half-brothers of Yahshua, who wrote inspired epistles that are collected and canonized in the New Testament. And you know, we hear a lot of talk about the redefinition of family in our day and age, and the destruction of the nuclear traditional family is central to the adversary's end-time strategy. And the whole concept of a traditional heterosexual marriage is mocked and ridiculed in the interest of corrupting the nucleus of our society. So this, we hear a lot of talk, but what he has to say about the redefinition of family is a lot more meaningful. So we're not going to delve into detail as to the precise dynamics of the adversary's strategy to bring about the eradication of the nuclear family as it has been known. But we're going to read what he has to say. And he answering said to them, "My mother and my brothers are those who are hearing the word of Yahweh and doing it." So hearing and doing is required of those who are his spiritual siblings. And so he debases his own biology, and the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant is that the blood of the new covenant was shared. They were all biologically related. They were Hebrews and Israelites, but those of the new covenant, the blood we share is the atoning blood, which saves us. And all ethnicities, racial backgrounds, et al., etc., are united under his blood, and it is a family of faith. So the Jewish people were a nation and a religion, but we are pan-national, and we are a family of faith, which extends not only across the world, but across the centuries. Final episode, verses 22 through 25, we're going to have enough time to make it, is the crossing of the Galilee, after which time comes their encounter with a demon-possessed man. And remember, we read that Mary Magdalene had 7 demons possessing her. This man had an entire legion, which was the basic military military unit of the Roman army of 5,000 to 6,000 men. That's how many demons he had possessed him. But if his redemptive reach is sufficient to reach into a woman's heart who's been possessed by 7 demons, it is equally efficacious, and he commands the demons to come out of the man much of the same way that he commands the storm which erupts around him to be calm and settle. So he's in control of the elements, he's in control of the demons. And on a certain day it came to be that he entered into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake," and they departed. So this actually represents a transition in scenery. A certain day, we don't know the certain day. This is an exact chronologically precise timetable, but eventually it came to be. We don't know when. The distance between the family, all the hitherto described verses we covered. This is a separate scene, it bears mention, though. But he's telling them to go onto the other side of the lake, and why would they be doing that? Because the call of Yahweh was imparted to Yahshua, and Yahshua was the one who extended their call, so his call is their call. Where they go, he goes. And that's part of our duties as disciples. We are to go where he wants us to go, do what he wants us to do, say what he wants us to say, be what he wants us to be. And as they were sailing, he fell asleep, and a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling up and were in danger. So Yahshua was human, he was divine, he was God, but he was also human. He got tired, he got hungry, he got thirsty, and he was asleep on this boat because as a physical being he would have required rest in order to function. And he's seemingly oblivious, he's so at peace, he has peace in the midst of this storm. He's sleeping away, much like Jonah was in the first chapter of the book which bears his name. And but suddenly a windstorm came in the Sea of Galilee. When we understand the geographical dynamics of it, it was especially prone to sudden mood swings of windstorms that seemingly came out of nowhere. And we didn't research the geography, but we know it's there. We just don't have time to explain it. And they were in danger, and they were filling up. That means their boat was filled with water. It was about to go under. They were about to perish. And they came to him and woke him and saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there came a calm. So just like that, all it took was a word from him. In other Gospels, we read that he held up his hands and said, Peace, be still. And like that, it was so. So these, before they have time to forget how fearful they were, the cause of their fear, and a faith in him is a faith that quiets all fears and storms. So the storms in our lives are not necessarily physical. They are more emotional and mental, but he has the power to bring peace to the commotions in our minds, in our hearts, and the physical, violent commotion all around us. And they stopped praying. They told him they were perishing, and just like that, he awoke and he rebuked the wind. Doesn't tell us what word he says in this account, but we know that he says, Peace, be still, in other accounts. And just like that, the wind and the water were calm and no more. And he said to them, Where is your faith? And they were afraid and marveled, saying one to another, Who then is this that he even commands the winds and the water, and they obey him? So he's asking them, where is your faith? If they had been faithful, they would not have been so fearful, because fear and faith are polar opposites and antitheses. No more than any one man can serve two masters, can fear and faith simultaneously dwell in the same vessel and in the same proportion. So but they were still afraid upon that, and they were even more afraid. They had no idea. They had not yet come to the full recognition that here was the master of all the ages, the King of kings, and the God of very gods. But Peter does come to the correct confession. He accurately calls him the Son of the living Elohim by the 9th chapter. And it's different in every gospel, but is always narratively prior to that confession. So in Matthew, we read of the scene we just read in the 13th verse. We read of Peter's correct confession in the 16th verse. In Mark's account, we read of the scene of the crossing of the sea at the end of the 4th verse. And then in the 8th chapter, we read of Peter's correct confession. And in Luke's, it's the 8th to the 9th. But there's actually some material that comes after that. But, the window is implicitly narrower in his path, but this was instructive in them, so they collectively struggled to know who precisely this man was. They knew there was something extraordinary about him, but it was flesh and blood has not revealed Peter's correct confession to him. So he received an answer straight from God himself that this was his very son. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.